Imagine a helping hand that, well, despite all the good intentions, it inadvertently becomes a kind of snare. A lifeline that over time starts to weigh you down, makes you more dependent, maybe, rather than truly empowered. It sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But today, we're taking a deep dive into just such a complex scenario, the intricate and often pretty controversial role of international aid in Somalia. Our journey today is guided by some really compelling excerpts from a text called Somalia's Aid Trap, a cycle of dependency and dismantling. Our mission, for you listening, is to move beyond the headlines and truly understand how aid, which is fundamentally designed to save lives, right, to alleviate suffering, has arguably perpetuated dependency and undermined self-sufficiency in Somalia. And critically, we'll explore the underlying reasons why this dynamic seems to have taken hold.
Yeah, and this isn't just, an academic exercise. Understanding this relationship between aid and dependency, it's incredibly important because it challenges so many of the common assumptions we all tend to hold about humanitarian intervention, about global assistance in general. It forces us, really, to look beyond the immediate act of helping and consider the long-term consequences.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's step back in time a bit. To really grasp the current situation, our sources insist we need to understand Somalia before 1991. What was it like then, and what exactly happened after the collapse of the Siad Barre regime? Well, before 1991, Somalia, despite its flaws, is described as having had a semblance of statehood. It had institutional frameworks in place. But the sources are quite stark here. The collapse in 1991 wasn't just a power vacuum. It apparently unleashed a torrent of factionalism, clan warfare, and an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. The text calls it, pretty bluntly, a man-made catastrophe.
And this profound chaos, it raises a really important question. How did it become such fertile ground, as the sources put it, for international aid agencies? Well, in the wake of all that instability, the famine, the violence, there was a clear moral imperative for intervention. It felt necessary. So this is when you see UN missions like UNOSOM 2 arriving, and along with them, just a multitude of NGOs, all ostensibly there to alleviate suffering. What's crucial here, and the sources really point this out, is that in this stateless void, these NGOs began to assume, well, quasi-governmental roles. Whether that was by design or just out of sheer necessity, it happened.
Quasi-governmental roles.
Right.
So if aid was meant to be, a temporary solution, what happened when these organizations stepped into those shoes? The sources suggest that what started as temporary, tragically, became permanent, leading to what they actually call a usurpation of local capacity.
Usurpation. That's a strong word.
It is. With their foreign funding, their logistics, these NGOs effectively became the de facto providers of essential services. End quote. And the sources argue this wasn't a gentle transition. It actively eroded local capacity for self-governance, for self-sufficiency. So for you, our listener, this really challenges that idea that aid is always just a temporary bridge. Here, the sources argue, it became a structural consequence of intervention in a dismembered state.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's follow the money, because this is where it gets really, really insightful. How much aid are we actually talking about, and where does it typically start its journey? Somalia reportedly received over $1.3 billion in official development assistance in 2016 alone. And figures often hover around $2 billion in subsequent years. That's huge.
It really is.
The sources underscore this as profound aid dependency. Major donors, well, they include key UN agencies like OCA, that's the UN's humanitarian coordination arm, UNDP, UNICEF, Western governments like USAID from the US, the UK's DHID, the EU, plus various private foundations.
Okay, so if we think about the bigger picture of effective aid, what happens to this massive amount of money as it moves down the chain? Does it actually get to local Somali organizations or the beneficiaries? The sources reveal a pretty complex journey. Funds rarely reach local Somali organizations directly, almost never, it seems. Instead, they flow through a series of intermediaries. The main conduits are the big international NGOs and the UN clusters. They then subcontract to smaller local NGOs. And this multi-layered structure, well, the sources say it creates transactional costs and opportunities for leakage. And the data they present is striking. A shockingly low proportion of funds, often less than 5%, sometimes even as low as 0.34%, is directly channeled to Somali NGOs or the actual beneficiaries on the ground.
Less than 5%, sometimes less than 0.5%. That's
So
staggering. So what's truly fascinating then is where the vast majority of this aid money actually ends up going. The sources are quite explicit about this. The bulk of it is absorbed by the overheads of NGOs.
Overheads.
Yeah, this includes things like inflated expatriate salaries, which are often spent on, quote, expensive and exclusive gated communities. Plus, significant administrative and logistical costs, flights, vehicles, offices. The sources collectively label this whole phenomenon bureaucratic bloat.
Bureaucratic bloat, right.
And the implication, they argue, is pretty clear. A substantial portion of what's labeled aid ultimately remains within the donor countries' economies or the international aid industry itself.
Yeah.
It just circulates within the system.
Which brings us to a really important question about the nature of the funding itself. How does earmarked funding, where donors dictate exactly how the money is spent, how does that impact local flexibility?
Local ownership. The sources highlight that the funding is overwhelmingly restricted or earmarked. It's not flexible money. This means donors exercise what the text calls micromanagement over spending. And this severely curtails the local NGOs' flexibility, their responsiveness. It often forces them to align with donor priorities, which, well, might not always match the actual local needs or culturally appropriate solutions. As a result, the local NGOs become, in the words of the sources, mere implementers of external agendas. This just perpetuates financial dependence. It hinders their ability to chart their own course based on, homegrown solutions.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper here. While aid is almost always presented as purely humanitarian, right? Helping people in need. What do the sources suggest are the deeper, perhaps underlying motivations of international donors in Somalia? Well, they make a pretty bold claim. They say these motivations are rarely as altruistic as their public pronouncements suggest, often concealing geopolitical, strategic, and deep ideological aims.
Geopolitical aims, like what?
They point out Somalia's crucial strategic location. It's at the Horn of Africa, bordering vital shipping lanes. And they also note its potential for developing strong nationalist sentiments, maybe combined with conservative Islamic values. So in this context, aid is described as becoming a tool of foreign policy, a tool to achieve a certain kind of stability, one that primarily serves the donor's security interests, which, according to these sources, sometimes includes a focus on, quote, the prevention of strong Somali nation, preventing it from becoming too independent or powerful, perhaps.
Wow, okay. So what's really insightful then is how these potential underlying motivations translate into the types of projects that actually get funded. Is there a pattern?
Yes, the sources say there's a clear preference. Major donors prioritize stabilization, which the sources interpret as funding initiatives aimed mostly at sustaining weak Somalia, keeping things just stable enough, maybe. Alongside that, you see funding for security sector reform and what they call rudimentary state-building efforts or lip service, things that look like state building but maybe aren't that deep.
Lip service. Ouch.
And furthermore, there's a pervasive preference for short-term visible projects, things designed for optics and photo opportunities rather than long-term structural solutions that might actually fix the underlying problem.
Right, the ribbon-cutting ceremonies.
Exactly. And while food aid is obviously crucial in emergencies, nobody disputes that the sources highlight that it can inadvertently create a perpetual cycle of dependency. It can potentially disincentivize local agricultural production, distort markets, and ultimately undermine long-term food security. They even report some really serious accusations that aid agencies have crippled local farmers by flooding the market with cheap foreign aid right when local farmers are trying to sell their own crops, and sometimes even delaying aid delivery during a crisis, which seems counterintuitive.
That paints a really complex and troubling picture. So what does this all mean for the aid machine itself once it's up and running in a place like Somalia?
Well, the sources suggest that this aid machine, once established, requires a continuous crisis to justify its existence. And the focus on short-term fixes ensures that such crises are never truly resolved.
So it needs the problem to continue, in a way.
It's described as a self-perpetuating mechanism.
Right. You might normally think aid is just about helping, but these sources reveal a system with these intricate, interwoven interests that can, perhaps inadvertently, prolong the very problems it claims to be solving. Okay, let's address an uncomfortable truth here. Corruption. The sources are quite clear this isn't just a few isolated incidents.
Yeah.
How is aid actually treated within Somalia? And what do they identify as the biggest corruption?
Well, they explain that corruption is seen as a systemic feature. Humanitarian assistance is often treated almost like a commodity to be exploited. And the sources don't mince words. They state that the fact that the majority of aid actually stays within the pockets of aid agencies makes a mockery of the whole claim of delivering aid. This, they argue, is the biggest corruption itself, the system's own structure.
Wow. Okay, so beyond that systemic issue, what specific examples of corruption on the ground are documented, and who facilitates them?
The sources detail things like outright theft of food aid, which was exposed by a UN probe back in 2023. This theft is often enabled by powerful gatekeepers. These are influential individuals, often linked to local clans or business elites. These gatekeepers apparently extort agencies, demanding payments or a cut. The result: a significant portion of aid, sometimes as much as half of food aid, never reaches its intended beneficiaries.
Half.
It's
enormous.
It's huge. Other forms mentioned include ghost projects and ghost workers, basically, funding for things or people that don't actually exist. And as we discussed before, those inflated salaries for expatriate staff within NGOs are also framed within this context of resource misuse.
So what does this tell us about local power structures and how aid interacts with them? It sounds like it's not separate from them.
Not at all. The sources explain that clan networks and business elites play a pivotal role in co-opting and manipulating NGO funding streams. And in doing so, aid inadvertently legitimizes their authority. Especially in a context where formal state structures are weak, aid can even be channeled to favor specific clans or subclans, which can actually exacerbate existing tensions and conflicts.
Right. So for you, the listener, this reveals that the issue isn't just about inefficiency, is it? It's about a potential fundamental flaw, where the priority becomes delivering aid at any cost, even if that cost includes compromising integrity and effectiveness on the ground.
Okay, let's really unpack the core concept here, the aid trap. How does the persistent presence of NGOs, even with the best intentions, actively disincentivize local capacity? How does it undermine sustainable development?
The sources highlight a few key ways. First, external organizations tend to crowd out indigenous initiatives. They provide services that local institutions, whether government or community-based, would normally develop or deliver themselves.
So local capacity doesn't get a chance to grow. Precisely. There's also a significant talent drain. Skilled local professionals are naturally drawn to the much higher NGO salaries. This depletes the human capital available for local governance or for building local businesses.
Right, the best and brightest get pulled into the aid sector itself.
Exactly. And maybe most fundamentally, the provision of free or heavily subsidized services undermines local markets and entrepreneurial endeavors. It makes it incredibly difficult for local businesses to start, grow, and compete when similar services are offered for free by NGOs.
This leads to a really important question then, about the long-term impact. What happens when interventions that were maybe designed for emergency relief just continue year after year after year with no clear exit strategy?
Yeah, the sources point out that many humanitarian interventions are simply replicated year after year without any discernible plan for ending them or handing them over. Examples cited include things like recurring water projects, health clinics, food distribution programs, the same things repeatedly.
And they mentioned a specific example that's particularly contentious.
Yes, the proliferation of gender trainings or women's empowerment programs. These are often viewed by, well, most Somalis, according to the sources, particularly intellectuals, with deep suspicion. They're perceived as a donor-driven imposition of Western values, often seen as culturally insensitive, ultimately not very effective in the Somali context.
And there's an irony there, isn't there?
A huge irony. The sources point out that Somali women are one of the most independent-minded women in Africa and the Middle East historically. They've traditionally led families, worked, been entrepreneurs, yet the sources mention things like Somalia being imposed to have a 50-50 gender quota in their parliament, and even replacing the word sex with gender on passports, which the source provocatively labels donor slavement.
Donor slavement, wow, suggesting a real loss of sovereign control over national policy in exchange for aid.
So what does all this mean for the concept of reliance? How does this pervasive aid system actually change behavior over time at both community and national levels?
The sources talk about behavioral reliance. Communities get accustomed to recurring food distributions. Youth might prefer NGO stipends over finding traditional work. Displaced families might move specifically to areas where aid is distributed in expectation of relief. Households might even delay their own coping strategies, waiting for aid.
And at the macro level?
At the macro level reliance, Somalia stands out. It's one of the most aid-dependent countries in the world. That official development assistance, the ODA, constituted a staggering 21% of its GDP in 2016. Compare that to domestic revenue, which was only about 2% of GDP.
21% versus 2%? That's an incredible imbalance.
It really is.
Imagine nearly a quarter of your country's entire economic activity being funded externally, not generated internally. Some critics cited even suggest this level of aid might actively erode the proud Somali tradition of self-reliance and dignity.
Which leads us to a fascinating point the sources make about the kind of dual role NGOs have played regarding Somali statehood itself. How have they, maybe inadvertently, both eroded the state and perhaps paradoxically also supported it?
It's complex. On the erosion side, NGOs have often bypassed government structures and created parallel systems. Most aid operates outside of government channels.
Which diminishes state legitimacy, right?
Exactly. Citizens credit the NGOs, not the government, for its services. This leads to a public expectation that NGOs deliver services the government doesn't. Then there's the talent drain from public institutions we mentioned due to the higher NGO salaries, and also the parallel priorities and fragmentation of development agendas, everyone doing their own thing, not necessarily aligned with a national plan.
But there's a support side, too.
Yes, the sources do acknowledge that NGOs filled a critical void and prevented collapse, especially during the worst periods. They ensured that a near-total absence of basic services didn't happen. And crucially, perhaps, they kept the idea of public services alive during the long stateless period.
So, for you listening, this really highlights the incredibly complex, often contradictory impacts of aid, where even efforts that seem well-intentioned can have these unintended long-term consequences on a nation's capacity and even its self-perception.
Let's turn now to the voices that are often marginalized in these big international discussions, the Somalis themselves. What do Somali intellectuals and aid beneficiaries actually say about this system?
Well, Somali intellectuals, according to the sources, lament what they call intellectual stagnation and dependency. They describe a culture of intellectual dependency, where local research, local knowledge, is often undervalued compared to external expertise. And they sharply criticize that brain-drained, talented Somalis being pulled into the aid sector instead of, say, rebuilding the country's institutions.
And what about the people receiving the aid, the beneficiaries?
They, while definitely acknowledging that aid can be life-saving, also express feelings of disempowerment and disillusionment. They criticize the short-term nature of much of the aid and sometimes a perceived lack of dignity in how it's delivered. There are apparently widespread complaints about the lack of transparency, the fact that NGOs often aren't really accountable to the local communities they serve, and there's a palpable sense, the sources say, that aid is often a top-down imposition rather than a truly collaborative effort.
That feedback is powerful. So it raises a vital question. What alternatives are being proposed from within Somalia to try and break this cycle of dependency?
The alternatives discussed emphasize a pretty radical shift towards genuine localization.
Genuine localization, what does that look like in practice?
It calls for things like unconditional and flexible funding, money that allows Somali organizations to actually set their own agendas, build long-term capacity, and respond to needs as they perceive them, not just following rigid donor rules.
Right, local priorities driving the action.
Exactly. It also advocates for real investment in productive sectors like agriculture, fisheries, livestock, and critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
Moving away from that endless cycle of emergency relief and those cynical frequent gender role clinics we talked about.
A shift from relief to development.
A fundamental shift. And crucially, it demands recognition and respect for Somali culture, Islamic values, and traditional governance structures as foundational elements for any sustainable development. These shouldn't be ignored or overridden.
So these aren't just complaints, they represent a clear vision for a different way forward, right?
Absolutely. One centered on self-determination and local agency.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for our broader understanding of international aid, especially in complex places like Somalia? It really seems to be a story of what the sources provocatively call an aid empire.
Yeah, and what's truly striking here is how the sources suggest this isn't just about simple benevolence anymore. It illustrates how humanitarianism itself can become, maybe unintentionally, an instrument of control and a perpetuator of dependency, deeply embedded in a broader geopolitical and economic architecture, a system that benefits more than just those receiving the aid on the ground.
And maybe the most provocative thought to leave our listeners with is this idea that the whole failed state narrative, which is so readily applied to Somalia, might conveniently obscure the role of external actors in its dismemberment and subsequent subjugation to an aid economy. It forces us to ask, doesn't it, who actually benefits when a state remains fragile and dependent on external help?
The source even makes that notable observation, suggesting quite controversially that Donald Trump's dismantling of USA may actually reduce the dependency trap and help Somalis learn self-reliance again, highlighting a potential, perhaps completely unintended, consequence of policy shifts far away.
Ultimately, the struggle for Somalia's future is, at its core, described in these sources as a struggle for true liberation from the subtle yet pervasive grip of the aid empire. Unquote. What stands out to you from this deep dive today? Perhaps it's a call to consider not just the what of aid, the food, the medicine, the training, but the how and the why. And its deeper, often uncomfortable implications for national sovereignty and genuine self-reliance, not just in Somalia, but perhaps around the globe.